Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Thanks for recording. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to what's going to be happening with the energy topics this week, and then I'll turn it over to our presenters. And I want to thank the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy for supporting our work. So today we'll get here presentations on reliability and resilience, and then tomorrow on energy affordability. On Wednesday, we'll have Steve Schiller talk about planning and evaluation for utility customer programs. So those are for energy efficiency and other types of distributed resources, but could be applicable for other types of utility programs as well. And then our energy topics wrap up on Thursday with a discussion of distributed energy resources in both distribution system planning and bulk power systems. And then we'll also be hosting one of the skills sessions this week, and that will be on Thursday. We'll talk about stakeholder engagement. I put a link in the chat to our slides for today, as well as the rest of the week. They're already posted, so you can get ahead of the game. And we'll be posting recordings there shortly. I also wanted to point out that we have slides and recordings from all of the informational webinars we've given over the last year posted online. So today, you're going to hear from two expert presenters. One is J.P. Carballo. He's a research scientist in Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory's Energy Markets and Policy Department. His work focuses on long-term power system planning, as well as incorporating distributed resources and electric vehicles in planning, and reliability and resilience valuation and prioritization. He's got a PhD and master's from University of California, Berkeley, as well as engineering degrees from Chile. And Josh Schellenberg has expertise in benefit cost analysis for utility resilience plans and transmission investments, value of reliability studies, and evaluating pilots and programs for DERs. He's got a master's from the Wharton School and master's in international and development economics from the University of San Francisco. So I do hope you feel comfortable to ask a question. You can raise your hand and then just take yourself off mute when I call on you. Or just, unmute yourself and chime in, and feel free to share comments or ask questions in the chat. We can keep that going. All right, let's hear from JP.
All right, thanks, Lisa. You folks can hear me well? All right, I'll take that as a yes. Yeah, it's great to be here again. This is my second time giving this particular webinar topic in front of this group, or the previous version of your fellows. So I'm hoping it's going to go smooth, and you folks going to hopefully understand well the technical and economic aspects of power systems reliability. All right, so in power systems, reliability is one of the three pillars of power systems planning and operation. These are the three balls that planners and operators have to juggle and keep in the air: affordability on one hand, reliability, and sustainability. And within reliability, there are a number of sub-elements that determine how reliable the power system is. Reliability is a property of the power system, and that informs how often the power may be available or unavailable. And there are several components that determine the levels of reliability. Power can be unavailable for many reasons. And as you see in these 5 different subcomponents, they span the whole value chain, all the way from the generation resources down to the distribution system. And they span different time horizons, ranging from the planning long-term time horizons all the way down to operational reliability, which is in the minutes and seconds. Resilience in this particular diagram is showed as a subset of reliability, and this is going to be part of a discussion that we're going to be having, largely supported by Josh, my colleague, in the second presentation today. So as I was mentioning, the reliability is analyzed and focuses in different aspects of power system planning and operation, depending on where you look. So the way we do reliability at the bulk power system level, this is power plants and transmission lines, it looks quite different than how we do it in distribution systems. And this is a mix of the characteristics of these different assets and infrastructure, but also the fact that they have been regulated and they have been managed very differently over the century plus in which we have had a power system like this. following this structure, and as I mentioned in the previous slide, I'm going to be separating my presentation in the bulk power system first and then the distribution system. So we'll get hopefully a good flavor of how reliability is assessed and valued in both. Similarly, it's important to distinguish that there are technical and economic aspects of reliability. Technically, we want to find metrics that describe how reliable the system is, so we can establish targets that we can plan for. We need to understand what kinds of data we need to inform these metrics and track performance over time. And we need to develop methods that allow us to assess the reliability of the system and decide on investments. And this is specifically calling the need for modeling. As you know, we can run experiments on our power system. And the type of events that affect reliability, especially on the bulk power system level, is infrequent enough that it's really hard to have enough empirical data to verify. So we have to create models and test the model's reliability and try to do the best job possible to reflect reality in those models. So we're going to cover some of these aspects as well. On the economic side of things, there are some key questions. For example, how much does it cost to make a system reach a certain reliability target? There is a certain sense that I hope to pass that if we want a more reliable system, you have to pay more for it. This is something that we cannot see in every single infrastructure system or every technology system that you come across. And it's certainly important in a $1 trillion system like the power system. How much customers are willing to pay for certain levels of reliability is quite important. We're going to discuss whether reliability could be tailored to customer needs and eventually start making an economic case for better or worse reliability. And then we're going to cover a few very, very succinctly some market and regulatory designs to incentivize investments to achieve these reliability targets. So this is what I was alluding for in terms of the cost and reliability tension. This is a diagram from ERCOT, the system operator from Texas, who was developing this analysis where they were contrasting different reserve margins in the bottom, and where to the left you have a low reserve margin, which is the cheapest way to operate the system, and to the right you have a much higher reserve margin, which means I have a larger buffer in my system. And you can see here how there is a clear trade-off that appears. If you have a lower reserve margin, I can spend little or fewer dollars in my capital, in my assets, but I might have a much larger cost of interruptions in that red bar. If I go all the way to the right, I do the opposite. I spend substantially more in capital, and then I have a much lower cost of my interruptions. But neither of these might be the optimal point. So they found in this particular study that right there in the middle, they had what they call the economically optimal reserve margin. So part of what we're going to do, especially during the bulk power system portion of this presentation, is to understand what governs the shape of this chart, both from a technical and economic perspective. And I hope that this will show, especially as you look towards the right-hand side or both of the extremes in this, why is it that we can't have perfectly reliable power systems, because the right-hand side of this curve is going to keep going up and up. And why it's very expensive to have unreliable systems that don't have enough supply to meet demand, because the cost of interruptions start going up. I think this is my only slide where I'm going to refer to resilience and reliability. I had to, because it is such a, I wouldn't say a hot topic, but there's still so many questions about how they relate. And as I mentioned, my colleague Josh is going to cover some of his presentation later. They're certainly related concepts. In some cases, they can be framed as hierarchical or derivative. For example, in that very first diagram that I showed, or they can be shown as a spectrum, where reliability, like in this diagram, reliability is on the left-hand side, and as you move into events that are less frequent but might have larger impact, you're moving to the right-hand side of resilience, meaning that you worry about different things in your power system, and you are concerned about different ways in which the system reacts to different types of events. So this is kind of one approach. In other cases, they're framed as very different and complementary. So we have reliability here and resilience. They deal with different things. I personally like more this spectrum, in part because it allows us to move more flexibly on both sides. And eventually, as we start defining better and more commonly used resilience metrics or resilience methods, this spectrum can be shifted towards the left and be more balanced. Another approach that I remember reading that was interesting is the idea that reliability can be described as an objective and resilience as an attribute. So the system as an infrastructure is resilient, and we want the system to operate reliably. So as I enhance the resilience of the electric system, I support the reliable operation. As you can see in that definition, I'm sort of using the second bullet here by making resilience be specifically about the infrastructure and making reliability be about the electric service. Again, this is not a fully coalesced, converged type of definition, but I thought it was interesting. In general, resilience is defined as the ability of the system to prepare, to adapt to changing conditions, to withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions, including the specific ability to withstand from deliberate attacks or naturally occurring threats or incidents, particularly those that are low frequency, that happen infrequently, but have potentially high impact, like large hurricanes or storms. This definition is more or less accepted, I would say, but the way you implement these aspects and how these different conditions lead to investment decisions is still widely debated, as you will see later. So let's jump into the technical aspects and the bulk power system. So mostly what I'm going to cover today is the technical and economic, with a more in-depth preference for technical. And I'm going to start with the bulk power system, and we're going to go down to the distribution system. So this is where we're going to spend the next 15 minutes or so. So from the bulk power system perspective, reliability starts having a specific definition. It is operating the elements of the bulk power system within equipment, electric, thermal voltage, and stability limits. These are elaborate terms, but typically it means that the whole system, the whole power system, as you know, has to be in permanent constant balance. It allows for minor fluctuations, but fluctuations that start going outside of those limits and create thermal issues, meaning that we're overloading our lines, voltage issues, meaning that we don't have the right voltage, we have either too high or too low voltage, or stability issues where these fluctuations are happening too fast and too unpredictably. All can lead to issues that can eventually end in either what they call uncontrolled separation or cascading failures, meaning that different assets in the power system have automatic disconnections mechanisms to pull out in when they see this phenomena, and that inevitably renders or results in a blackout, in a cascading power system failure. So reliability of the bulk power system is concerned about staying within those frames. And NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, is by mandate in charge of verifying the reliability status, or the reliability health of all the interconnected networks in the country. Very briefly, not all the networks in the country are subject to NERC jurisdiction, because not all of them are outside or cross state lines, and NERC cannot make any investment decisions. NERC can only diagnose and recommend actions, but there are other bodies that make decisions about how to achieve reliability objectives. Similarly, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, reviews, approves, and enforces the standards that NERC develops. But again, of course, it doesn't have the ability to decide on investments. That's still the purview of states and their stakeholders. So within bulk power system reliability, there are three core elements. Adequacy, which operates in the years to months time frame, and is simply the study of whether there is enough capacity to meet load. The operation part of bulk power system is concerned in the days or hours, minutes, or even seconds time frame. This is in what concerns here is whether there are enough resources to balance, to maintain voltage, to maintain frequency, and to keep those reserves. The third one is contingency. Contingency deals with what do we do when we had adequacy problems or we had operational problems and we could not avoid, or either we tried to avoid a blackout with some extreme measures, some last minute measures, or the blackout occurs and we have to restore the system and emergency response. So contingency are mostly plans and some specific preparations and assets that need to be in place to restore the system or to avoid catastrophic failure. So we're going to spend most of our time in adequacy, in large part because it is where most of the investment is focused and where the investment signals are produced. and also where a lot of the attention has been put over the last few years for different reasons, particularly load growth and large extreme weather events that have prompted the need to review whether we have good practices to ensure the systems remain adequate, meaning that we have enough assets and enough investment to maintain adequacy. Adequacy is defined, as I mentioned earlier, more formally as the ability of a power system to meet demands for electricity using supply and demand-side resources. This is a little bit of an older definition. It's 14, 15 years old. You can see in more recent definitions, NERC has been refining some elements of their own adequacy. And for example, in this case, they are taking into account scheduled and reasonably expected unscheduled outages. So this is hinting a little bit on how do you want to model the adequacy of the system. Again, we cannot infer adequacy solely from empirical analysis. So we have to model our power system and, as you will see, run very exhaustive analysis to determine how adequate our system is. From a component perspective, a resource adequacy framework, this is the way we go about measuring adequacy and establishing adequacy, requires at least 4 key components. We need to define adequacy. What you just saw is a definition that prompts certain types of decisions, certain types of actions from a modeling perspective, but also from an institutional perspective. We have to define target and tracking metrics. So how are we going to ensure that our system is adequate? What is the level that societally we think is the right level to achieve? Remember this constant trade-off between economics and reliability. So as I want a more adequate system, a system that has more resources to meet demand in all hours, that means I'm going to have to spend more money. What is that balance? What are the methods, models, and data that I need to measure adequacy and then to test and diagnose my adequacy? And then how do I make procurement decisions based on these results to incentivize investments in the right places, in the right technologies, in the right time? A 5th component here is one that we had suggested in prior research. It's slowly taking, I think, hold in practitioners, but this idea that as we have actual events that hit our system, and we have actual, especially events, not the big ones that prompt what's called root cause analysis, where everyone stops and someone issues a large 150-page report on what happened, which is what happened typically in large winter storms or hurricanes. A retrospective evaluation would be looking at the use of reserves on an ongoing basis and trying to report how faithful the modeling that we're doing is compared to the actual performance of the system. There's just a lot to work here, but we believe it's an important component that has been missing in traditional frameworks. From a process perspective, resource adequacy requires several steps. So what I show you is the pieces that go into creating the models. But in terms of how you go from inputs to creating planning needs and eventually investments, there are a few components here that are important. This particular construct here comes from MISO in one of their recent reports on resource adequacy metrics. You can see that at the core of this work, there is a probabilistic risk model. It's a type of model of the power system that tests the power system in multiple different scenarios, sometimes thousands or even hundreds of thousands of versions of how the system could operate in certain conditions, trying to look for those combinations of conditions that do make the system fail. And in doing this, we can calculate specific metrics to understand when and how it's failing. And then we can decide whether we have enough resources and if that level of failure is acceptable. As I mentioned earlier, we can't have a system that doesn't fail, but we can, with this approach, we can know how often the system might fail and whether that's something we accept as users or as a society. So in the next few slides, we're going to cover some of these pieces, hopefully for you to understand how resource adequacy is established and calculated. From a methods perspective, we have transitioned, I wouldn't say very recently, but probably this is something that happened in the last 15, 20 years, where we moved from a more deterministic analysis that was really based on looking at the peak demand. And so you would determine a peak demand in some way, especially as you were doing forecasts when you are doing forward-looking adequacy analysis, trying to check or determine what kinds of investments I need to meet forecast peak or load growth. I would look at a single peak hour, and I will just say, okay, this is the amount of megawatts that I have in this peak hour. This is all the resources that I expect to have, and how these resources have performed. historically. And so I think I have enough. And it was a pretty simple analysis. You can do it in a few pages and with a spreadsheet. In the modern approach, we have recognized that this analysis has become quite insufficient for many different reasons. The system has changed, the type of resources have changed, load growth has been more uncertain and harder to predict, and all the countervailing factors that affect power system operation, including customer decisions, including weather elements, including the way some of these technologies can all fail concurrently more than individually, have required an analysis that is probabilistic, as I was describing, where we try to run many simulations of our system to understand how it could perform in a wide range of conditions. And we're not looking anymore at the peak hour. We're looking at all hours of the year. This is the conceptual explanation how the resource adequacy assessment works from a probabilistic perspective. So you can see here that we have distributions. These distributions, probability distribution, tells us there's a certain likelihood of, in this case, for example, let's look at the red curve. There's a certain likelihood that most likely you're going to find load at any given time at the 5,000 megawatt level in this example. It could go up to 6,000 megawatts, and in the extreme, the really peak can be close to 7,000 megawatts. There's a slight chance that it go all the way up there. On the blue curve, we have the distribution of how generation might fluctuate. And that generation fluctuates because we have resources whose output is not defined on their own, like solar and wind. It fluctuates because we have coal and natural gas whose fuel input might also be fluctuating as well, depending on a number of reasons. It fluctuates because any unit can fail. And so at any given time, my generation levels could be lower than I have in their nameplate capacity. So as you can see, there is this little gap down there to the right-hand side of the blue curve and under the red curve. That is the gap where I have more load than resources available to meet it. That is what I want to avoid. Measuring the area under that curve is what gives us a sense of how adequate my system is. If that area is too big, my system is less adequate. If that area is small, my system is more adequate. And you can see that there are really two ways to reduce that area. Either I shift my blue curve to the right by making my generation more predictable, perhaps, or just adding more generation altogether, or I shift my red curve to the left by adding energy efficiency, demand response, and other types of resources that do have the ability to shrink the load in the right times, making that area smaller. In terms of measuring the shape of that area, there's several things going on in that area. When I showed this very simple diagram, what I was hiding behind is that these shortfalls can occur in different flavors. They can be long or short. They can occur multiple times a year or just in one time, and they can have a large amount of loss or a small amount of loss. So these different things all play a role in how we have to plan for adequacy. The most common criterion that we have used over the last 40 to 50 years is what we call the 1 in 10 criterion, which is largely a frequency criteria. This means that we expect that at most 1 day every 10 years, we're going to have an actual shortfall. This 1 in 10, the history of this 1 in 10 criterion is unclear. It was developed, 50 years ago, and it has just prevailed as the benchmark that we use for power systems all around the world. You'll see in a little bit, I have an example of the types of metrics that we use around the world, and this has been very prevalent. This 1 in 10, those 1 day every 10 years, is often interpreted as 24 hours in 10 years, or 0.1 day per year, 2.4 hours per year. But neither of these are the same. It's very different to have one event in a 24-hour period than having one event in a 2-hour period. So there are some statistical issues with this implementation. Nonetheless, this 1 in 10 has served us well, largely, again, because of characteristics of the grid back then. And now it's a target that has started to be analyzed. An alternative metric that is a little bit less, that is easy to understand, is the loss of load probability. So how likely I am to have a shortfall, at least one shortfall during a period. Again, it doesn't tell me how the shortfall looks like. It just tells me that there is a certain likelihood that I will have a shortfall. And typical values that are used for planning are 3%, 5%. Now, that doesn't mean when I do a 5% loss of load probability that I'm thinking or expecting that 5% of the time the power is out. This means that 5% of the time, my reserves will be small enough that I'll have to start looking into specific contingency measures to prevent the system from having an actual blackout or from having to shed load. So this calculation doesn't account for the buffer that operators build. So just so you know, it really tells me how much investments do we need, how much buffer do we need to make sure that we can reach that smaller or that specific margin for loss of load. As I was saying, loss of load expectation and probability are measure, the frequency or probability of an occurrence of happening of an event. The expected unserved energy, the AUE, measures the expected magnitude of the shortfall. So this gives us a flavor of whether the shortfall is expected to be very large and cover a large part of the system, a large spatial has a large spatial magnitude, or if it's rather small. And as you can think, it's different if I have multiple small shortfalls than you have a big single shortfall, even though both may add up to the same. Derivative metrics that are used these days is the loss of load events, which is a more precise measure for frequency. It measures the number of events with at least 1 hour of shortfall. So in this case, it's bringing the duration into the measurement of the frequency. And the loss of load hours is counting the number of simulated hours when I have a shortfall. And as you can see, all of these interact in different ways, and they give me different flavors of how the system is performing. So in these two examples, without going into much detail, these different diagrams show how metrics that are the same in one level, or how performance of the system that have similar metrics in one level. For example, on the left, they have the same amount of hours lost, is 4 hours, but the top system has those as much deeper shortfalls, is 4 hours, but each hour is losing a significantly more energy than the one in panel B. Similarly, in panel C, we have 3 events, or 3 instances with events up, and below we have 3 continuous that will be recognized as one single duration of 3 hours. And those, of course, have very different implications. So the trend right now is for independent system operators and regional transmission operators to start moving into using multiple metrics, ditching the 1 in 10, which is almost now agreed upon that is insufficient, and slowly moving into using multiple metrics to assess adequacy. This is what I was referring in terms of the criterion. This is 2020, gives us a flavor that only 5 years ago, you can see here to the right, that most of the North American ISOs and RTOs were using the 0.1 days per year, or the 1 in 10 metric, perhaps with the exception being WEC, which was using a percent criteria for loss of load probability. And in Europe, they had been using largely a loss of load hours. Europe is also in the process of changing and shifting their hour-specific or hour-focused resource adequacy metrics to something that has also recognized frequency and magnitude. One of the main outputs of this whole resource adequacy assessments, once I know that I have a certain target that I want to meet, is, okay, so what is the amount of extra capacity that I need to meet that? As you may have inferred at this point, if I have a certain load level that I'm hoping to achieve or to meet, I'm not planning to have those level of resources. I'm planning to have a higher level of resources such that it gives me a buffer, a planning reserve margin, such that when something happens and these total resource available shrinks, I still can have a decent amount of reserve that allows me to meet my obligations. So this planning reserve margin is a single value that quantifies this buffer needed. As you can infer also, there is a tight connection between the metrics that we were just covering and this buffer. A lower loss of load probability will require a higher planning reserve margin. Similarly, if I want a lower amount of loss of load hours, I also need a higher planning reserve margin with specific technologies that are able to operate for enough hours to avoid interruption. The planning reserve margin is part of what's called the capacity obligation for load-saving entities in wholesale markets, and it's also a key input in resource plans, where the capacity expansion model, this is the model that's deciding the least cost way to meet load, is trained or is coded with a higher margin. So the model is not meeting load, it's meeting load plus a margin to ensure that the resulting system has a certain level of adequacy. The other derivative metric coming out of capacity or of resource adequacy assessments is the capacity accreditation. If you think about it, not all resources are the same. A wind and a solar resource is very different than a natural gas or coal resource, or very different than a battery resource. But all of these can contribute to resource adequacy depending on how they operate and what the load realization looks like. And so this means that each resource can be assigned what's called a capacity credit. And this is very important in both market settings and resource planning settings. In wholesale market settings, the capacity accreditation is used to allocate capacity payments to resources. So if you're a resource and you are contributing to capacity, you get a payment based on how much you contribute. And that's established through the resource adequacy assessment. Similarly, if I'm a load-serving entity and I have to demonstrate to my ISO that I have covered my bases with my load, I have to show, based on the capacity credits of the units that I'm using to fulfill my load, that I have enough and that I'm adequate. In the IRP world that uses models to achieve least cost outcomes, the resource adequacy, the capacity accreditation coming from resource adequacy assessments is used to build into the capacity expansion model a specific constraint that makes sure that I'm meeting, essentially, I'm derating the resources through the capacity credit to ensure that I'm meeting an adequacy constraint. The typical or more traditional approach these days, and at the same time the best practice these days to calculate capacity accreditation, is the marginal ELCC, the effective load carrying capability, that some of you may have heard, and we're going to cover in a second here how the ELCC is calculated. The ELCC uses the loss of load expectation study, which is the typical name of the study that develops resource adequacy assessments, to run an experiment. And the experiment is, how much does reliability improve when I add a certain amount of a resource to a system, compared to if I added what's called a perfect capacity resource. A perfect capacity is a synthetic or fictional creation in our model, which is a resource that if I have 100 megawatts of that resource, those exact 100 megawatts show up to serve load. This resource has no outage, has a perfect ability to generate. And it's really just useful as a benchmark because it tells me I can use that benchmark to compare any other resource against that perfect capacity and then establish a ratio. And then I can bring in and compare all the resources against that ratio. For example, in this particular example, I'm looking at adding, and if I'm number one here, and I'm in a case where if I have a certain, I'm trying to aim to that 0.1 LOLE, you can see that the blue curve points at 7,500 megawatts total in my capacity. So the question is now, if I add renewables and I lower, or it could be any resource, but in this example for renewables, if I add a resource and I lower my LOLE, then what is the amount of perfect capacity that I have to remove and achieve the same level of target resource adequacy? And that gives me a sense of how much reliable. Typically, if I add, for example, 100 megawatts of solar, and this is a summer analysis, I might need to remove 50 megawatts of perfect capacity to create an equivalent system. You know, as I remove capacity, the system becomes less reliable. And I want to achieve that 0.1% or 0.1 days per year reliability. And so that establishes that 100 megawatts of solar are equivalent to 50 megawatts of perfect capacity. That's a 50% credit. You can see in this example from PJM, what are different types of capacity credits and how much they have changed over a couple of years between the 2024-2025 capacity market run and the more recent one. These changes come about from different reasons, in particular changes in methods. You can see, for example, in this particular case for PJM, the solar fixed panel and tracking panel examples show that they were heavily derated. Solar was being credited about 50% of its capacity, and then it moved down to 14% capacity. And several resources were derated as well, including storage, demand response. They sort of polished their analysis and revealed that these resources were not showing up as the analysis were saying. And this is what I was saying earlier, as you refine these studies and you incorporate more actual empirical data, you get better results to describe the capacity contribution for the resources. We're going to move now into achieving adequacy. Once I have these planning reserve margin, I have capacity accreditation. Now the question is, well, how do I encourage resources to show up and make sure that as a planner, I'm bringing in the right amount of resources? This depends largely on the institutional organization in a given state or jurisdiction. Vertically integrated states, as I think I mentioned before, rely on integrated resource planning. So it's a centralized sort of regulatory or regulatorily oversight process that ensures that the systems is adequate with a least cost. In restructured states, there are different approaches. Three of the ISOs have capacity markets where they rely on the market to achieve a certain administratively set target for capacity, and the price is a result of how tight those markets might be. There are some hybrid approaches that mix those capacity markets with some more administrative intervention, or perhaps a reduced role for the capacity market used as a secondary tool, like in MISO. And then there's one market, or ISO, ERCOT, where there is no capacity market and relies only on the energy market to go up enough in price on certain stressful, tight hours to signal that capacity is needed on those hours and encourage the investments. Building a little bit in what vertically integrated states do, they require IRP. This diagram to the right from our report from last year is kind of showing how things fit together. And you can see to the right, there is a resource adequacy assessment model that feeds through the capacity accreditation in the capacity expansion model, and there's an iteration there where the capacity expansion model produces a least cost expansion portfolio, and the adequacy assessment model makes sure that that portfolio is calculated under deterministic conditions does meet the probabilistic needs of the system and is ensuring that it's at least meeting that minimum target. And that's coupling and iterative is the best practice to ensure that the IRP process produces a adequate system. On restructured cases, as I was mentioned, in restructured states, capacity markets is one of the more common mechanisms, or it's used at least in 3 states, and there are at least 2 other states that run some flavor of capacity market. And as I was saying, these are markets that are set by establishing a certain demand for capacity, and resources bid on an annual basis on this curve. Some of these are forward-looking 6 months out, and some of these are forward-looking 3 years out, which means that you're bidding now to provide power for 3 years out, which gives you space and time to build new resources if you don't have it on hand. Markets are competitive, so the capacity price is obtained and the participants receive the price. They don't exactly know which one it is. Payments are administrative. So sometimes a cost can be administratively set. So you can bid your capacity credit, your accredited capacity that can meet adequacy, and you're going to receive a certain payment that comes from an administrative setup. In both cases, these prices are paid by load-serving entities, and they're passed to customers. So it's very important to make sure that those markets are operating efficiently, and those payments are also least cost and efficient. And it's not trivial to do so. There's been particular attention recently to some ISOs where their markets have resulted in really high prices, and customers might most likely have to foot a larger bill because there was too much uncertainty, and it was very hard to design these markets. Most of these markets operate with auctions. And I think this is the last slide on the wholesale markets, and this is where the technical side of things, as we have been talking about reliability targets, start meeting and shaping into the economic side of things that we're going to talk a little bit later in this deck. But what's very important is that, as you see here, that blue curve on the right-hand side is a set of targets that the planner, the system operator, is establishing to try to ensure that there is a match between the amount of capacity that I need and the price that I'm willing to pay for that. And this is as much as an art as it is as a science to design this left curve. The right, the sort of sloping curve, the supply curve here, is the result of agents coming into this auction and bidding for their capacity at certain costs, and the resulting clearing price is what is going to be paid by all actors in the system. Finally, just one mention on the energy-only markets that are used in ERCOT and Europe. As I mentioned, these are designed for participants to recover both their energy or operational costs as well as their fixed capital costs through only one revenue source, which is the energy source. And means that there's no capacity payments. There's no separate payment for capacity that are covering resource adequacy needs. The energy payment is covering both your operational costs as well as your capital costs. And one of the key elements here is to create another type of curve, similar to the one that you saw. It's called the operational reserve demand curve that is also is creating an adder to the energy price that is trying to construct the amount of money that I need to give to operators to be incentivized to put capacity, and because they're not only operating to get paid on their energy, that for many operators that will be unprofitable. They need an extra payment, and that comes through these operational reserve demand curves. There's a whole world behind how to define these that we're not going to cover. I just wanted to make sure that you knew the term if you want to cover those later. Let's move now outside of adequacy, where we spent the bulk of our time here, and we're going to spend a couple slides in operation and contingency. Operational reliability is the ability of the power system to balance supply and demand in real time. So this is we went from the years out analysis that we do in adequacy, making sure we have the right investments, to now the very near term, where we're trying to make sure that we have resources that are flexible and can ramp enough, or loads that are flexible and can adjust enough to make sure the system is always balancing load and supply on a real-time basis. Some of the key services that are needed here are synchronization, frequency control, voltage control, and damping. There are other pieces of reliability that are more involved with protection, and in this case, restoration, where we're putting into our contingency bucket. And this operational reliability is typically achieved by certain units that are providing frequency and voltage control. These are units that are managing and modifying on a real-time basis specific parameters on how they produce power to maintain balances across the power system. There is, again, a whole world behind this that we're not going to cover today. One thing to know is that in general, once we have achieved adequacy, it generally means that we have enough types of resources to manage frequency and voltage control. The main challenges that we're seeing these days in this space is that as we replace rotational machines with inverter-based resources like solar and wind, those have a different way to respond to different signals in the power system. And we need to program those inverter-based resources cleverly to simulate the same. But it's definitely doable. It's something that operators are learning how to do. So we don't have major issues here. But for example, a recent exception of this is the large blackout that occurred in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula a few months ago, that you may have heard of. That was entirely an operational reliability issue. There was enough adequacy, but there were issues managing some of these frequency and voltage controls that led to separation of the entire country out of the European system. Finally, in contingency, the contingency operation is really a set of plans that look to implement actions that prevent further system degradation when things are starting to go south. So this is when the system is really in trouble. The contingency operations allow us to prevent the system from further degrading, sometimes at the expense of shedding some load to achieve balances. But the least load possible is, of course, better, because we're trying to prevent a whole blackout. And so the cost becomes secondary. The load shedding mechanisms and the load shedding schemes are included in these plans, because it will be unfair if I rely on the same people or the same customers to shed load all the time. So there are ways in which these are public, or at least discussed with different regulators and stakeholders, to ensure that these plans are well drafted and really effective. These plans also include how to re-energize the backbone should a blackout occur, and do this in the fastest way possible. So continuous operation relies on several types of reserves that, again, these are typically procured through the resource adequacy process. These are spinning, non-spinning reserve, and black start units. These are all ways in which different units are operating, sometimes are not operating at full capacity, and they allow you to give you a buffer for spinning reserve. And actually, wind and solar can provide spinning reserve by going down when requested and dropping some power, and that actually can be quite useful to provide services for contingency operation. Let's move now to the distribution system. Here we spent a fair amount of time talking about the bulk power system reliability. We're going to go down now to the distribution system. And reliability for the distribution system is much focused on a network concept. It's the idea of delivering uninterrupted service to customers. In the distribution system, as in the bulk power system, it's impossible to have 100% reliability. There's always going to be something happening, especially in a very widespread grid that as working close to customers, where some accident might occur. But there are ways to build the systems to be more reliable and to have more continuity of service. What's also important is that about 90% of customer interruptions do originate in the distribution system. They're typically local in nature. This is in part because we do focus on making sure the bulk power system doesn't suffer issues, because if the bulk power system fails, the magnitude of the blackout, the magnitude of the interruption is significantly larger. But it doesn't. So this means that there is a much higher challenge in keeping the distribution system reliable, given that is a much more exposed network. I'm going to take a moment here to make a distinction. If I would like you folks to walk with something out of this training today, is the difference between an outage and an interruption that is typically used outside what is technically correct. So an outage is what we used to call an asset that cannot perform a function. So an outage is when a pole is broken or a transformer explode. We call that is an asset that has been in outage. An interruption refers to the ability of the electric service or availability of electric service to end users. And so it's essentially your electric service can be interrupted or not. The important distinction is because we actually build power systems or distribution systems to ensure that if there's an outage, there is not necessarily an interruption. This is actually particularly important for bulk power systems, where you may have heard the idea of the N-1 criterion. The N-1 means that I can sustain one asset outage without having service interruption. And that's typically the way we operate transmission systems, where we don't use the transmission line entirely. We use it at half capacity, maybe a little bit more, such that if the other parallel line were to fail, all the load can be mounted in this line and keep supporting power with minimal disruptions. At the same time, interruptions can be caused by things that are not outages, like, for example, a plane maintenance. So it's important to have these two concepts separate. On the distribution system side of things, metrics and targets are quite different. They have been developed for decades, and these metrics are typically performance metrics. They're not used to plan the system. They're more used to verify how it's working and make some adjustments. These metrics summarize the reliability outcomes of actual circuits, and typically at an aggregate level. So in contrast to bulk power system reliability, which is largely based on simulations, distribution system reliability is actually framed as around actual outcomes about performance. In several states, there are maximum or minimum standards for utilities based on performance. For example, these circuits cannot have more than X amount of duration, X amount of hours without power, or customers in this particular circuit cannot suffer more than X interruptions in a given time period. These are the the most common standards defined in IEEE standard 1366, and you most likely have heard of the SAFE, SAIDI, CAIDI, and CAFE metrics. These are all measuring different aspects of interruptions. As you can see, the distribution system folks for a while had been measuring duration and frequency, as opposed to just the measurement of the frequency in bulk power system. That's mostly, again, because bulk power system didn't want the event to occur at all. So frequency is what they were mostly focused on. In this case, the distribution system measures frequency and duration, and it averages that either for the whole system or for the customers that suffer interruptions. Another important concept in the standard is the measure event day concept, the MED. The measure event day is a day when the reliability metric exceeds a statistically defined threshold that is based on previous actual historical data. This is important because in many cases, utilities have different targets with and without measure event days, and they report their SAIDI and their SAFE and their CAIDI with and without measure event days. More recently, there's been a push over the last 10 years or so to add new metrics to the standard. And in the latest version, there are these new customer-centric metrics, like the number of customers experiencing multiple interruptions, or number of customers experience multiple momentary interruptions, or interruptions for long duration. The idea is to start getting a little bit better at understanding the customer experience, because SAIDI and SAFE, especially when they are averaged at the distribution system level or at the feeder level, they're still hiding the fact that certain customers at the tail end of a circuit can be having a really hard time, can be having a really poor experience in their power consumption. And this is something that these metrics try to address. To track interruptions, distribution utilities have developed what's called outage management systems. They're softwares that are used since the late 1970s and eventually developed commercially in the 1980s where utilities learn about interruptions either from customer calls, which is the old way in which they would learn. Now they have smart grids, smart meters to automatically learn their interruptions, and also they sense their grid with different devices to understand where voltage is not present, and then they can bring this into a software that can locate the interruption and potentially can send crews to solve it and provide some estimate for restoration times. And this is the kind of thing that it's behind what you see in this kinds of utility outage maps. This is one example from PG&E. You probably have all been familiar with these maps, depending on where you live, and the outage management system is what supports these kinds of maps. So for power system reliability, for distribution systems or reliability, there's a set of, again, planning processes that can be established. In some cases, certain jurisdictions have developed distribution system planning processes, like the diagram here from Eversource in New Hampshire, where reliability and resilience needs are part of the planning process. We're planning to meet those needs as addition to other needs in the distribution system. In other cases, utilities have their own internal planning processes that are not as public, but they follow similar ideas. They're trying to ensure minimum levels of reliability, especially if the regulator is enforcing them. And in a few states, there are regulatory requirements to report reliability. Typical reports include listing the 10 or 20 worst feeders and their statistics over time, demonstrating the utility has to demonstrate that they have making an effort to improve reliability in the circuits, and etc. These reports can be actually quite long, and they provide a good insight on what the challenges to meet distribution reliability targets. We're going to spend now the last bit of this presentation talking about the economics perspective of reliability, or what I call the costs of unreliability. So power interruption costs money. It's hard to measure, but there is definitely loss of food. There's wages that may be not acquired. There's losses in production from firms. There's costs of running backup generators. There's cost of buying them and then the fuel for running them. There's cost of customers that might want to relocate to locations with power so they feel safe. And so all of these kind of up to billions of dollars. And one recent estimate puts average annual losses as high as $150 billion a year. So there's definitely this tension between more reliability and more cost is very tangible. A framework to try to make a decision how much I should spend involves, starting here from the left, understanding the types of hazards and their frequency, whether and how they can cause outages in the system, and whether those outages may translate into interruptions and how those interruptions are characterized. I can then monetize the part of the energy that I'm not served, and potentially I can mitigate some of the energy that I might lost if I had, for example, a backup generation or a battery. And with the concept of the value of lost load that I'm going to explain in a second, I can monetize this amount of energy that I might not be able to use and put a value in it. And this allows us to conduct a cost-benefit analysis where I can see, based on these assumptions of frequency and the amount of interruptions that I could expect, this is what it could cost me. And that means that this is roughly what I would be able to spend, or that I should be willing to spend, to prevent interruptions. The value of lost load is one key concept here to translate the technical interruptions, the technical reliability in both bulk power system and distribution systems into a monetary value. That the good definition provided by Will Gorman, one of our colleagues, is that the value of lost load is an electric industry metric meant to encapsulate the societal benefits of reduced outages in a monetary figure. And this is the conceptual, the concept behind the value of lost load. And you will see that this is really similar to that very early diagram that I shown being applied in ERCOT, where you had to the left a lower margin that has a lower capacity costs, but maybe a higher value of lost load cost. And so it's up to a higher total cost. And to the right, I have a much more expensive system, but I have a much lower value of lost load. And that sweet spot in the middle is what essentially capacity markets and integrated resource planning is constantly trying to achieve, having the right amount of reserves that is a balance between capital and value of lost load. You can see how if I move the value of lost load in this curve, I shift the entire reserve margin. If I assume that I have a much higher value of lost load, I want to have a higher reserve margin because it means that it's more costly to lose power, and vice versa the same. And so producing that value of loss load curve is actually quite important, but at the same time, quite challenging. This diagram that you can probably review later in more detail is saying that there are a few different ways to go about establishing a value of loss load. There are survey methods, there are modeling methods, there are hybrid methods that we have developed in our department that mix surveys and modeling, economic modeling, to produce more faithful representations of how customers react and what are the actual costs to customers of not having power across wide ranges. And there's a revealed preference method that we're not showing that is very particular economic approach. Some examples of value of loss load in the industry are the ICE calculator and POET. These are two tools that we have developed that actually are used to produce values of load that are widely used by utilities in particular to support their investments in reliability and in some cases in resilience with monetary figures. So my final slide here in terms of how these economics operate in practice. In bulk power systems, in the vertically integrated states, typically the value of load is not used. The most common way in which we establish a certain reliability level is not by asking the question, how much are we willing to pay, is by really saying, all right, let's assume we agree that this is how reliable we want to be, and let's just do a least cost analysis. You can see that it's a very different decision, but it avoids the issue of having to calculate an explicit value of load, although in this constraint that I'm imposing, the 1 in 10 or other constraints, I have an implicit value of load that is rarely communicated. In a few cases, we have found IRP scenario analysis using a value of load to monetize resilient benefits of certain portfolios. So saying these two portfolios that more or less cost the same, if I were to use the value of load based on how much energy they might lose in this specific set of events, I actually can prefer one over the other. In the restructured states, the value of load is more used as it informs the ceiling of the auction and the operational reserve demand curves. So some of those curves that we saw a few slides ago, they are actually set up using the value of load. So many of these market operators do run surveys to establish the value of load in a more or less rigorous way. And on the distribution system level, it is not also common to see value of load on the regular planning process, but there are a larger number of utilities pushed by utility regulatory commissions that are requiring benefit cost analysis, especially for resilience projects, but also for reliability projects. And so they do need a value of load to monetize the losses against and compare them against the capital cost and say, look, the expected annual losses, monetary losses that I have is this. This is my expected annual expenditure is lower, so I should do this project. It's cost effective. So my final slide, some key takeaways out of this electric system reliability training is that reliability is about having enough supply, demand, transmission, and distribution resources to keep electric service up almost all the time. Remember again, it's very, very expensive to have it up all the time. Bulk power system reliability focuses on having enough generation to meet load, which is resource adequacy, enough resources and controls to keep the system operationally stable, which is operational reliability, and have contingency plans. Resource adequacy is tightly linked to investments. And so as I analyze resource adequacy, I will produce investment needs that then will have to be procured through different types of mechanisms depending on where you are. In distribution system reliability, we're mostly focused on tracking actual events, frequent, shorter interruptions. And I want to track them. I want to see who's being affected. And there are different mechanisms through which regulators in particular try to ensure that customers are receiving good quality service. And finally, the value of load is the monetary link between reliability, technical reliability, and system performance. The calculation is quite challenging and time-consuming, but I think we're getting better at it, which may mean that value of load might play a more active role in deciding investments in the future to come. The presentation has many references that you folks are welcome to review, and this is my contact information for any questions you may have. Thank you.
That was incredible, JP. So much information. I hope everybody's not totally overwhelmed. This is important stuff. I welcome you to add questions to the chat or take yourselves off mute or raise your hand, however you want to do it. I'm going to take a first question here in the chat. JP, do you have customer level or household level data on annual losses from power interruptions? Did somebody put you up to that?
No, I mean that's I'll say it's in my bucket list of my wishes of having that data. There are ways to acquire that data with arrangements with certain utilities that have AMI, that have advanced emitter infrastructure. They are willing to release. Unfortunately, for better or for worse from research perspective, anonymous data. So we lose track of who's exactly behind that value of that lost energy. But that is indeed one of probably the main developments that could occur in distribution system reliability in particular, to start managing or establishing reliability targets at the customer level using smart meters. That will be a revolution and a huge challenge for distribution utilities.
Great, thanks. We have a question from California.
Hello, this is Mritika. I just had a quick question regarding your page 6, where you had kind of like the total system cost versus basically how much reserve margin is economical, and I see it's like 11%. Is that kind of like how much you should reserve? Say if you had a microgrid, is that how much ideally you should reserve with the grid, or how would I interpret that?
Yeah, that's a good question. This diagram is made at the ERCOT level. So you're thinking about the entirety of Texas. This is the amount of extra capacity that you need above the peak demand that they expect to happen in Texas to make sure that you're operating the system within a certain minimum total cost that's balancing the cost of not needing power versus the cost of having more capital. A microgrid operates a little bit in the same way. It's trying to be designed. If I have a too big of a microgrid, it's very expensive, right? If I have too small of a microgrid, I might not meet load at all times. So microgrids have some of these, and actually your home battery, for people that have battery systems at home, they also have a reserve margin in there where the battery will go down to a certain level, sometimes for technical reasons, but you can manipulate that if your variable load is too high to ensure that you have a reserve in case an interruption hits. And that margin can be moved depending on the season. As you know, in California, it's wildfire season, is more likely I'll have an PSPS event than in the middle of the winter, and so I can adjust that reserve. So these reserves apply pretty much in every single system from the battery all the way up to the wildfire system.
Let me add that for a vertically integrated state, like California, even though you have ISO RTO, you still have integrated resource planning and vertically integrated utilities to some extent. So JP, these are not just like fixed numbers, right? Like it's you run these simulations in IRP and you find the portfolios that are most robust, looking at cost and the risk that those costs might be different than you think under different scenarios. So the way I like to think about it is the planning reserve margin in that context is very portfolio specific. You know, it might be 12% in one portfolio and 14% in another. I'm just making up numbers, but does that sound about right, JP?
Yeah, the capacity credit of resources is going to define what the percent is and how you meet it. So in some cases, a grid that has a ton of solar and wind will have a huge reserve margin. It doesn't mean that it's more expensive. It just means that you need to secure that gap because these resources will fluctuate more. And it's also true that these planning reserve margins can be and are being set at the seasonal level. Because again, the winter and the summer reserve margins might be very different depending on what resources are supporting the grid in those seasons. And so places like MISO that have 4 seasons, they're already seeing how they have different decompositions of portfolios showing up in winter and summer, and they're conducting auctions on winter and summer to meet load on those different seasons.
Great. We have a couple more questions, so let's try to move through them. So on slide 24, the tables, the person is asking whether this indicates that fossil fuel generators are generally considered more reliable to meet demand than renewables such as wind and solar. I don't think that's what you're implying here.
No, I think this is specifically saying that some fossil fuel resources have a higher likelihood of being available in the stress hours of the system. A resource being reliable is not something I like to say because reliability is a property of the power system, not of a specific resource. A resource might be available, it might perform in certain ways, but it's actually, if you think about reliability of a resource, if you want to boil it down to whether it goes in outage or not, these machines that have a lot of pieces and steam involved can fail more often than the simple power solar panel that is just a piece of silicon. So it's hard to define a resource as being reliable or not, and that's why we want to think about a portfolio. That's why we want to think about the portfolio producing, and you need both. You need, because that's, for example, let's say the combustion turbine there, 90% in the 2024 rating, suddenly down to 62%. how did that happen? Well, they discovered that there are these particular machines might not be available in certain times of year when they're most needed. And even though in theory they could be operating at all times, they're not. And so there are many ways in which this each one of these units contributes to the resource adequacy of the whole system. And so it's important to have them in portfolios rather than individually.
Do you want to underscore just for a minute a definition of accreditation again?
Yeah, accreditation is the ability of a resource to show up in the most tight hours of the system. And so it's the percent of the nameplate capacity that I think might be available. And I say I think because we're modeling this at those stress hours. And those stress hours do change across seasons. And so something that PJM doesn't do, which is have seasonal ratings, is something that MISO does do. And for example, solar capacity credit in the middle of the winter is very low, but it might be much higher in the summer. And so it's important to capture those performance differences for adequacy contributions.
There's also a question about programming inverters. You talked about the Spain example. So what is the process for doing that to respond to fluctuations in system frequency? And is it a one-time programming, or are these inverters responding to communications from a grid operator when called upon?
That is a good question that unfortunately I don't have an answer to. This is not my area of expertise at all. I do understand that I think the latter is becoming true. These systems are becoming more responsive in real time. They have control strategies that are local and centralized, so they can respond locally to conditions that they are measuring, as well as receiving inputs. And so that's making those inverter-based resources smarter and smarter as they go. The trick is to make them all function in a complementary way, because a single inverter-based resource can be blindly doing its own thing. It has to depend, especially as you add more inverter-based resources, but they're all automatized. I don't think the operator is sending any specific message. There are, systems level decision algorithms that are instructing these and managing these inverter-based resources and orchestrating them to provide the necessary inertia and other, minute and second level services.
It's entirely different topic. One question is really interesting. Can you comment on the use of reliability metrics like the ones you showed, SAFE, SADE, KV, many others, the use of those metrics for performance-based rate-making approaches?
I don't know if I have any examples at hand, because the states that I know have used this, they largely use them for penalties. So if you don't comply with a certain target level, you get penalized. You get a fine. And so utilities have the incentive to try to avoid the fine, not really because of financial issues, because of the PR. It's really hard for utilities to be able to show up and say that they're doing a good job from a reliability perspective, and they know that the customers care. I am not familiar with any performance-based regulation approach that eventually rewards utilities for exceeding a reliability standard. And if anything, that performance-based regulation reward would be tightly linked to the value of lost load, because you should not pay a utility to be extra reliable just a certain random amount. There's a willingness to pay for that extra reliability, and at some point customers are going to be like, I'm not willing to pay more for that. I'm fine. And so you can't keep rewarding and rewarding. So it will be an interesting exercise to set up that reward mechanism.
That's a good point. How does assessing the cost of an outage change for grids in different locations? Like compare New Jersey to California or Alaska. Is there any data source available that you could recommend that could be used?
Yeah, so for example, the intuition is that in places where I have more economic activity that is more impactful across the country, for example, and the season perhaps is where I have this larger economic activity occurring, determines places and times of the year where power is more valuable than other times. For example, the example I usually say, an interruption in the middle of a 2 a.m. is generally uncared for, but an interruption in the Super Bowl is really much not desirable, and you're willing to pay a ton of money to have that interruption not occur. So that's a quick, simple example of how over time and space, the value of lost load changes. In part, that's what makes it so hard to measure it, because we really conduct values of load study very generally for a single space and over just a single occurrence. But these values could fluctuate as the market fluctuates, just up and down. So for now, we have these efforts that we're spearheading efforts to try to get better spatially at recognizing that the value of lost load does change by economic sector and over different counties. And our POET tool is geared in that direction, trying to identify economic activities that are more valuable and that could eventually translate to higher GDP loss. And that allows us to have an objective way of measuring, if I don't have power in this particular county in this time of year, this is my loss. Look at that. We can now have a number to justify investments in that particular resilience for that particular county or in neighboring counties that could support that one on having power.
JP, do you want to drop in the chat the links to the ICE calculator and POET?
Yeah, I can do it after
Thank
I
you
finish.
very much for your presentation. That was great. Thanks for answering all those questions. Next up, we have Josh Schellenberg with Berkeley Lab to talk about resilience.
Thank you, Lisa. Just gonna pull up my presentation here and hopefully you all can hear me all right.
Looks good. Sounds good.
All right, let's get into resilience. Here's a look at what we're going to cover today. There's quite a bit of information and resources here. In the interest of time and not wanting to inundate you all with way too much information in these 2 hours here. We'll refer to some resources and there are links in the presentation where you can get more information. But we did want to make sure that this presentation covered a wide range of areas that you can see here. So let's dive into state requirements for resilience plans. As many of you know or have directly experienced, there has been a wide range of extreme weather hazards in recent years, including wildfire and hurricanes. And so what you've seen throughout the country is the response by states to develop resilience planning requirements for regulated utilities. So in this case, regulated utilities refers to investor-owned utilities that are regulated by the state public utilities commission or similar entity that like a public service commission. And you can see here in the map in green the states that have resilience plan requirements that are in place, and utilities have already filed plans that have been reviewed and the investment has been approved or a portion of it in many of these states. In blue, we see where states' requirements have been identified, but there's no utility plans filed yet. And then finally, we see in Louisiana that state requirements are underway and are yet to be approved to move forward for that state. The four largest states, California, Texas, Florida, and New York, account for a third of the US population. So that's a large amount of utility customers that are going to benefit from these requirements for the utilities to invest in resilience. And 11 other states have adopted these plan requirements. And so from May 2022 to June 2024, so just about a 2-year period, more than 30 regulated utilities have filed resilience plans under these requirements. And when we totaled up all of the customers that would be, that are customers of those utilities that filed the requirements, we found that it's 47 million utility customers. And given that each utility account has, two to three people living there in terms of the households, that comes up to about 135 million people, or about 40% of the US population that stands to benefit from this resilience investment. So this has been a big push in recent years. You can go to this Bridging the Gap report that's linked here as the source for this map. And then also there's a database from Pacific Northwest National Lab that is linked at the bottom of this slide as well. And that database focuses on wildfire mitigation plans. So here's a summary of all of those state requirements. Some of them cover multiple hazards, including in Hawaii, Louisiana, and Texas, where the utilities can develop a plan to address a wide range of extreme weather hazards. In other cases, such as California, Maine, and New York, the requirements focus on climate change, resilience, and vulnerability more broadly. And then in Massachusetts and New Jersey, they focus on infrastructure modernization. And In other states, though, you do see that there are storm protection plans specifically. So it's not looking at climate more generally. It's not looking at multiple hazards. It's specifically focusing on the impact of storms in terms of the plans that the utilities need to develop. And that is in Connecticut, Florida, and Michigan, as well as New Orleans, has their own requirements in place that are separate from the state of Louisiana. And then finally, out west, you see a lot of wildfire mitigation plans that are specific to wildfire, particularly in California, which has had plans in place for nearly a decade now, and other western states. On the right here, you can see a summary of all of the components of these requirements and the whether they require a vulnerability assessment, how they incorporate hazard exposure, attribute metrics, performance metrics, and then finally, how the utilities go about the evaluation and prioritization analyses. And you can see based on the legend there that it goes from looking at whether those requirements are required and specific or more recommended and high level. So in the different states, the components of these resilience plans may have requirements that are very specific and required, or it might be more of a high level plan. So you do see some variation there. And so as part of that Bridging the Gap report, we developed this framework that lays out these components of resilience plans. And I'm going to walk through many of the insights, starting with vulnerability assessment. And so these assessments include hazard characterization, looking at exposure or the degree to which utility assets could face a given extreme weather hazard, sensitivity, which is the degree to which availability or performance of an asset could be affected by exposure to that hazard, and then consequence. And then finally, vulnerability assessments also may take into account community sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And so what you can see here at the bottom right is a common framework for thinking about vulnerability assessment. This was from the city of Seattle vulnerability assessment from a couple of years ago, where they looked at their municipal utility as well as other infrastructure as part of the city of Seattle. And they assessed the exposure in addition to the sensitivity, and then you're kind of minusing that adaptive capacity, because if certain assets or communities have a large amount of adaptive capacity, that makes them less vulnerable. And so that high level equation is what gives you the vulnerability assessment. And this is the common framework that you see that ties back to the IPCC approach, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that has been around for quite a few years now. And then, here's some examples that dive into the results of these types of analyses. And so you can see here along the left is all of the different asset areas for the utility. And then you can see the main extreme weather hazards that the utility focused on as part of their vulnerability assessment. And you can see that in this matrix, each asset area and each extreme weather hazard are rated in terms of being a primary vulnerability, a secondary vulnerability, or a low vulnerability. And so this is a way of summarizing those vulnerability assessments in an easily digestible manner. Importantly, though, these vulnerability assessments need to have a clearly defined vulnerability scoring rubric or rating, right? And so in this case, it's primary, secondary, low, and you can see in the vulnerability assessment that's linked here how exactly they define a given asset being a primary, secondary, or low vulnerability relative to a given extreme weather hazard. Importantly, there's a lot of things that utilities can do from an operational perspective to mitigate vulnerabilities to extreme weather hazards. And so this is an example from a Duke Energy Carolinas report, where they looked at the different process areas for the utility and noted that asset management is a key area or process within the utility that is effectively vulnerable to extreme weather hazards because they need to incorporate adjusted design criteria, especially if there's changing precipitation patterns and heat patterns. And so what was interesting about this approach is that they not only looked at assets in the vulnerability assessment, but it looked at whether there was given process areas within the utility that could be improved to mitigate impacts and vulnerabilities. And in this case as well, you can see on the rightmost column in this table that there was a specific way of categorizing and rating vulnerability for planning and operational vulnerabilities versus assets. And so you could see there the clear rubric that they used for assessing those vulnerabilities. Now we'll get into hazard exposure, which is the second piece of this overall framework for resilience plans. And the big part of hazard exposure is, the data is just really key to assess the extent to which different assets are exposed to hazards. And so many of you may have GIS capabilities or interested in developing capabilities in those areas. You see that leaned on quite heavily when it comes to assessing extreme weather hazards, as well as exposure, as we'll show, because as in many resilience plans, whether it's storms or wildfire mitigation, it's an overlay of the hazard patterns and how they may change over time and change in terms of their severity and frequency, as well as assets. And so the overlay of those two things is what allows utilities to prioritize investment in those areas that have the most pressing vulnerability. And so now you can see here again the GIS and geospatial analysis coming into play with respect to analyzing the exposure, which is the degree to which assets may experience specific climate hazards, right? And so a given asset may not necessarily be resilient to storms, but that is only important if it's also exposed to a very significant and increasing severity and frequency of storm. And that's why it's the two factors that come together that really allow utilities to focus in on the areas to improve resilience and invest in resilience in their system. The third component of our framework here is attribute metrics, and those are system characteristics that contribute to or describe aspects of the resilience of a system or community. And so I think it'll be helpful to dive into an example here and look at it in terms of the phases of resilience. And so when you think about any extreme event, whether it's extreme weather or could be a cybersecurity attack or any of these low probability but very high impact scenarios or events that get analyzed in resilience plans, you have the various phases, which is anticipating the event, withstanding the event, adapting to the event, and recovering from the event. And so by looking at all of these attributes for the utility and the communities across these four phases, you're able to assess key metrics that may factor into your planning. And so here's a good example here of the community resilience metric that is in this adaptation phase of resilience. And on the right, you'll see an example from Southern California Edison, where they took data from throughout their entire service territory, which covers population of like 15, 20 million people in Southern California, including going up into the mountains in the eastern part of the state. And they looked at community resilience and developed their own metrics to really understand where are the places in which the community, if an extreme event occurs, whether it's a wildfire or maybe an extended power outage due to wildfire risk, they're able to assess, as you can see here, these hot spots in which the community may lack the ability to adapt to the event. And there's a wide range of factors that they've laid out, and it's linked in this report here, related to how close the community is to a cooling center in the context of an extreme heat event, how easily the community can go relocate to another place in case there's an extended power outage, and things of that nature, including socioeconomic variables, given that low and moderate income people are generally less able to adapt easily in terms of being able to just go relocate temporarily as compared to higher income populations. And so this was an approach and a metric that Southern California Edison developed that was a interesting approach that can get incorporated into resilience plans, so that you're not just looking at the utilities assets and the weather, but also how the community adapts when an event occurs. Now we'll go into performance metrics. JP covered a lot of these, so I'll skip over some of them. But as he mentioned, the industry in general has had some fairly standard reliability metrics, SAIFI, SAIDI, CAIDI, going back a couple decades now. But those metrics, in many cases, don't really give you a good sense of what is happening on these extreme weather events that are more of a focus for utility customers, utilities, and their regulators, especially given recent events tied to wildfires and hurricanes. And so there's a wide variety of metrics that have come out of these events, and thinking about, from a planning context, how to evaluate the effectiveness of resilience investments. And so there's a lot of different approaches. It's still definitely emerging in terms of what the standards will be. So we're going to dive in here and look at some of these metrics, but in many cases, they're still evolving. Utilities are still coming up with new approaches. But when it comes to electrical service and just assessing the power interruption events, you can see here many of the events or the metrics that JP referred to. But there's the key acronym here, MEDs, which is major event days. And so what utilities have typically done over the years is report their reliability metrics excluding those major events, because the idea is that the utility can't control the weather, right? And so if you want to see how the utility performs over time, it makes sense to exclude those major events so that you can see what the resulting reliability was after you include the things that the utility can't really control as much. But now that resilience investment has become a much bigger focus, there's been a push to look at these metrics, including all of the days, including these major events, and in some cases diving into specific major events to see how long it takes to restore power to customers. And then also, as you can see here, developing metrics like SEMI and CELID, which are customers experiencing multiple interruptions in a given year, in terms of the percentage or the number of those customers for a utility, as well as customers experiencing long interruption durations. So for that metric, you can set a threshold of, say, 24 hours and say, in a given year, how many customers experience an outage beyond, or a power interruption longer than 24 hours, and then track that over time and see if it's increasing or decreasing, and how the utility may be performing in that particular area when it comes to these extreme weather hazards. So here's an example from the California Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety, which focuses on wildfire mitigation. And you can see that these events and the cause and the metrics associated with them leads to a very detailed set of reporting. And in many cases, regulators have requested this type of detailed information from utilities, but it also takes people on the staff side when you receive this information to dig into the details. And so some of you are in that position of getting this, deluge of data from the utilities tied to a resilience planning or resilience reporting requirement. I encourage you to dig in and see what types of trends and interesting things you can find in data that may be coming out of reports and requirements like this one. And so there are also metrics associated with asset damage or the recovery from an asset perspective as well. There's a lot more details in the Bridging the Gap report, so I'm not going to get into the details here, but you can see there's a wide range of ways of looking at asset related metrics and the damage and tying the cause of the event to why the utility may be experiencing particularly long interruptions. And then we also have metrics tied to the monetary impact, and this is something that JP covered as well. This is actually the results of an analysis from the Power Outage Economics tool, or POET, that JP mentioned. And this is looking at the utility in Chicago and the surrounding areas, Commonwealth Edison, and looking at a 1-day, 3-day, and 14-day outage and seeing what is the impact on GDP. And you can see here, this is looking at it in terms of the negative impact as a result of those long duration outages. But you can also use the ICE calculator as well to estimate the costs associated with shorter duration interruptions up to 24 hours. And in many cases, even when there is a major storm, the vast majority of the customers experience power interruptions that are shorter than 24 hours. And so you can use the ICE calculator for those types of analyses, but then the POET tool is really meant for these significantly longer outages that start to impact your overall GDP for a given area, because there's such a huge scale in terms of the impact of those types of very long duration, widespread events. Here's a few additional dimensions to think about with respect to performance metrics. Critical facilities is a major focus. Not all customers are the same, right? If it's a hospital, fire station, emergency operations center, it's really important to make sure that they keep their power on, or that the utility in some cases may support some sort of backup power. Utilities, for the most part, have circuits identified as their critical circuits that they can't, cut load to, or the critical circuits that they prioritize in terms of restoration. But there are a lot of metrics that look specifically at impacts to critical facilities and circuits. And then with the increase in wildfire risk, we see a lot of public safety power shutoffs, or PSPS events. And these are the cases in which the utility intentionally de-energizes portions of the grid to reduce the risk of wildfire. And that's when the utility assets actually cause the wildfire. And so that is a unique element of wildfire risk. In particular, it's because the obviously extreme weather, drought, high winds contribute to that wildfire risk, but then the utility asset in some cases actually causes the wildfire under those conditions. And so that's why you're seeing in many cases out west in particular this intentional shutting off of the power, or these PSPS events. And finally, the distribution impacts are important, as shown by the SCE community resilience metric. And there's a lot of data, whether it's at the census tract level or even more granular, that can be used to assess how the resilience of a utilities service may vary throughout the system based on some of these distributional factors. So the last piece of the framework here is the evaluation and prioritization analyses. And these can be broken down into ex post analyses, where you're comparing performance of the electricity grid before and after implementing resilience measures. And then you can also think of it in terms of an ex ante analysis, which is estimating the effect that resilience measures will have on performance metrics. And then the prioritization analysis is a really key area with a lot of emerging approaches that, because at the end of the day, it really comes down to identifying, assessing, and prioritizing resilience solutions that mitigate vulnerabilities, in particular, mitigate those vulnerabilities in the most cost-effective way. This is a big issue around the country with electricity rates increasing, in some cases faster than the rate of inflation, but in many cases actually just right in line with inflation. But increasing costs in general have become a concern. So prioritizing the right investments and making sure they're cost effective is a major theme and area of focus for many states and utilities when it comes to resilience planning. So here's an example of some ex post analyses. At a high level, it's basically just looking at, before and after. So in this case, it's Detroit Electric looking at before and after a preventative maintenance program went in place, looking at it in terms of 3 different metrics. Here is a Florida Power and Light, where they look at a major hurricane of category 3 back in like the mid 2000s, like 2005, I believe, and then look 12 years later for an even stronger storm, and seeing how much more effectively they're able to restore power in fewer days, and that the average days to restore power is significantly lower after Florida Power and Light had a major round of investment in resilience with hardening their infrastructure to hurricanes in particular. And then you can see here, when it comes to those PSPS events I was talking about with respect to wildfire, the key is actually to understand that those events are not causing undue amounts of outages or power interruptions to customers, because the utility is proactively cutting off power. And so this is a way of looking at those metrics to see how the reliability performance compares after the utility starts implementing those PS events, which will, obviously cause more power interruptions and hurt the reliability metrics. But you can, as it's shown here, kind of slice and dice the data to get a sense of what is the overall impact there, to make sure that, in some cases it's negligible, in other cases it's a small difference. But when it comes to MAFI, which is momentary outages, there's a pretty significant change there. But just wanted to, highlight that analysis tied to the PSPS events. And here's some examples of prioritization analyses, and they can broadly be based in 3 categories. So first off is benefit cost analysis, or BCA. Secondly is risk-based analysis, and third is multi-criteria assessment. And so the first 2 are pretty similar in terms of benefit cost analysis and risk-based analysis, where you're looking at the cost of something and then seeing how it compares to the benefits. The big difference, though, is that the BCA approach compares and prioritizes resilience measures based on the present value of monetized benefits and costs. So it's monetizing all of your benefits using, value of lost load, the ICE calculator, POET, other things that may be factored into the calculation, including like reduced restoration costs for the utility, things of that nature. And doing a dollar per dollar comparison of the benefits relative to the cost. When it comes to more of a risk-based analysis, it's looking at the risk reduction. And in some cases that might not like fully monetize all of the risks, but you're saying, okay, if I'm reducing my risk by 10, 20, 30%, whatever it might be, and it's costing me however many millions of dollars for the investment, you can compare different competing investments and rank them to figure out what gets you the best amount of risk buy down in the most cost effective manner. And then finally, multi-criteria assessment is when there's more of like an index that is created based on a variety of factors. Often this is something that various stakeholders come together and say, here's how we want to rank different investments. And then they have like a weighted average of those different scores. Could be on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. But it's not explicitly monetizing any of the benefits in terms of a dollar value, but then, creating this composite index. As far as, looking at prioritizing investments and like the cause of outages, it's also a cause of increasing costs. This is just an example from a utility in Connecticut where they had a storm a couple years ago that caused a huge amount of external contractor costs and mutual aid, as they had to bring in crews from all over the country and the region to address the impacts of an outage that for the tropical storm Isaias that hit Connecticut and surrounding states a few years ago. And this just gives you a sense, though, from a prioritization perspective, when you're looking at these increasing costs of utility restoration, it can be a major benefit stream, right? Because if you have a more resilient system, you're able to mitigate some of these costs and reduce that impact to customer bills. So it's a trade-off, right, between making that proactive investment that may lower costs going forward versus taking on that risk of like, well, there's going to be storms. We can't, keep 100% of the crews that we need for the worst storms all year long. We do need to rely on these external contractors, but this example just shows how you can kind of optimize between those proactive approach and the reactive approach. In this case, the regulatory process found that the utility could have done many things to improve its processes associated with external contractors and bringing them in more proactively to mitigate these cost impacts. And that's yet another example of how the operational processes of a utility can be a major area of resilience investment. And here's a look at the prioritization approach for the Tampa Electric Storm Protection Plan. And I found this to be a particularly interesting approach. They did use the ICE calculator to monetize the benefits associated with reducing power interruptions during major storms. And in many cases, you're not just prioritizing across projects of like this solution better than that solution, but you're trying to figure out like what is the right level of investment, right? And so this was an interesting analysis that they did and showed how they got to this $1.6 billion optimized proposed investment for storm protection based on the total life cycle net benefits under different storm scenarios that you can see here. As I mentioned, there's a lot of other resources here. One of the studies that Lisa and I worked on last year is this resilience plan template. Similar to the Bridging the Gap report, it walks through the state requirements, utility practices, and emerging best practices. But one of the useful parts of this report is that you can go to this link here and you can get a Word document template of a resilience plan and all the key components that go into it. So I will walk through that shortly, but as you may have noticed from this presentation and the prior presentation, there's a lot of information out there, a lot of emerging best practices. And so in many cases, you really want to start small and build from there. And so, developing a comprehensive resilience plan that includes all items in this template may not be feasible for some utilities at this point. And so we encourage utilities to, especially smaller utilities or states that don't have resilience plan requirements to, start with a vulnerability assessment for one or two priority hazards. It could be wildfire out west, could be storms in the eastern part of the country or Midwest, and really learn from the process and continue iterating as planning practices evolve, as the data evolves, new data comes in, new approaches. And then it's important to incorporate the stakeholder input and the evolving state and local objectives with each iteration. So we have this template here. We have a lot of practices that we've highlighted today, but this will just give you a sense of a good place to start if you're working in an area or an organization that's just getting started with resilience planning. And so there's a lot of factors to consider when adapting this resilience template. So those are laid out here. And then as you can see in that Word document, which is shown here on the right, it's broken out by the executive summary, and it just gives you that template of what you can fill in if you're going to be developing a resilience plan or reviewing a resilience plan from the utility and want to make sure they check off a lot of these key areas of things that need to be included. So the executive summary gives you that sense of what are the objectives, the hazards, and what are the proposed programs and costs, benefits, metrics, et cetera. And then the section 2 of the resilience plan template dives into the vulnerability assessment. And that's where you start to get some of that geospatial analysis of exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity, many of those attribute metrics that I was reviewing previously. And then here's an example vulnerability matrix. It looks similar to the examples that I showed earlier, but it's just an easy one that you can fill out. You can identify the category of utility infrastructure processes. You can identify the hazards that are meant to be included, and then start to rate based on high, medium, low, primary, secondary, low, whatever might make sense. And having that clearly defined rating tied to it is key, though, as I showed in the earlier examples. And then the resilience template includes a section on the description of each proposed resilience program. So really giving you that breakdown of each particular investment area and how it's addressing priority vulnerabilities, and then including a rationale for selecting and prioritizing the proposed program. And then finally, what the estimated benefits are and proposed performance metrics. And then section 4 is the projected rate impacts, which is a pretty standard approach across many different types of utility investments to give a sense of, okay, the investment might be $1 million, $1 billion, whatever it might be. Sounds like a lot, but when you take the overall usage of the customer base, what is the cost per kW or per kWh for the average residential, commercial, or industrial customer, to give a sense of what that, at the end of the day, what that rate impact is going to be to the customer as a result of this investment. Another resource that we wanted to point out is the NARUC resilience framework. And so you can see that shown here. And it's broken down into 6 components. And this is really laying out a good stakeholder-driven approach to identifying what are the goals and objectives, the use cases, defining key terms, how to go about implementing it, and guidance on questions to consider during the overall planning process, and then having the process leadership and participation. So it's a slightly different way of looking at resilience planning, but also important to consider when working with a variety of stakeholders to put together a resilience plan. And here are some considerations to consider when applying the NARUC framework. Last main section here before wrapping up is wildfire mitigation examples and considerations. And key thing here is just to think about how wildfire risk is spread throughout the country. This is the FEMA National Risk Index, and you can see in the Southeast, there's a pretty significant amount of fire risk now for wildfire. There were some pretty major fires in the Carolinas along the coast last year. I believe some of those may have been utility caused or are still under investigation. And then, PG&E has been at the forefront, for better or for worse, of wildfire mitigation led by utilities. There's been a major amount of investment. I am a PG&E customer. I've seen all of the crews they have out there doing vegetation management, investing, undergrounding, wide range of solutions. And so they put together this guidebook, which is a really helpful resource that highlights tools and processes that help with near-term risk-informed wildfire mitigation. And the key there is the near term, right? Because there's a lot of things that utilities can do, but prioritizing what is needed right now, especially with wildfire risk, given that it can ramp up very quickly if there has been an extended drought or if there are high winds coming. This guidebook lays out a lot of the operational processes that are highly cost effective for managing wildfire risk. Here's a geospatial analysis from a cooperative utility in Colorado. And I just thought this would be good to highlight because even though it's a small cooperative utility, they were able to do a great job of really pinpointing the areas that are the highest wildfire risk based on the weather conditions as well as the communities in the area. And then finally, I do want to point out this Berkeley Lab working paper, which really highlights the value of certain operational changes, including these fast trip settings and public safety power shutoff. These are investments that actually cause more power outages as the result of wildfire risk, but the analysis shows that it's highly cost effective in terms of the avoided structures burned. Undergrounding is not as cost effective based on this metric, but it does virtually eliminate all wildfire risk. And so it is more costly, but it does eliminate nearly all of the risk. Whereas some of these other solutions, you may not proactively cut off the power every time you need to. But what their analysis did show is that the vegetation management that PG&E spent many billions of dollars on has not been the most cost-effective solution, at least in terms of continuing to do it going forward. The initial round may have been very cost-effective, but perhaps it's not the most cost-effective solution going forward. And then we have this example from Encore, which is a utility in Texas, just showing the very large scale of wildfire mitigation related investment that came out of their resilience plan based on the all hazards analysis that they did under the Texas resilience plan requirements that I talked about earlier. So even for this utility in Texas that had major vulnerabilities to storms, hurricanes, wildfire definitely rises to the top as a major area of investment for them. Finally, with respect to wildfire, we gotta, I can't go without talking about the risk. It's, how it's putting financial pressure on utilities and electricity rates. Many utilities are getting downgraded. Even municipal utilities might get downgraded by their creditors. But then you also see the impact on electricity rates from the California Legislative Analyst's Office here. And so cost-effective investment is just a major theme. And so this is the section to wrap it up, and we have several key findings laid out here, as well as emerging best practices. But I think the key thing I want to leave you all with is to think about investing strategically, because we hear that a lot. We want to be strategic. We wanted to be strategic. And in my mind, partially from having gone to business school, strategy is really about deciding what to do and what not to do, right? It's not to say you're never going to do certain things. It's just more maybe not now, right? And so grid resilience investment is under multiple cost pressures. Customers expect their power to be restored more quickly. Society is becoming more dependent on the electricity grid, but costs are inflated, right? Particularly for utility labor and equipment. Both of those are critical to improve resilience, and the cost has increased substantially, including in that example from Connecticut associated to bringing in those external crews and contractors. But we have an increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather hazards. But then we also have the issue of the credit ratings of the utilities. If the credit ratings of the utilities go down a lot, then that's going to have a cost that ultimately gets passed on to customers as well. And so cost-effective risk mitigation investments are really key. As it's talked about in that prioritization analysis slide, using a benefit cost ratio or risk spend efficiency or value spend efficiency are really key to be able to prioritize the highest value available options and decide what to do in the near term. And then also having highly targeted solutions and changes to operational processes. So undergrounding might be a good solution, but only in very highly targeted situations, right? And that's where that geospatial analysis comes into play. And then, finally, that cost effectiveness analysis can really guide strategic improvements through performance evaluation and metrics, and just having that ongoing iteration and improvement. And so that is the final note from me. Here's the contact information, and we'd love to get some questions. Looks like I'm right about on time, but we were running a little bit late to get started. But I can stay a bit longer if needed, or if anybody would like to reach out to me and Lisa with any questions, you can see our contact information there.
Well, we've got a few minutes, so be happy to answer
Okay.
questions
Yeah,
right now.
yeah, for sure.
I did put in the chat, recognizing that some utilities are pretty small, but might have issues with resilience, just because of their location, right? And so Josh and I put together, primarily Josh, like a little Excel template that makes it pretty easy to make a start. I think that's the message that we're trying to convey here. If you're not doing it already, good time to start.
Yep. Did you want to cover some of the questions that came up, if there were any?
There aren't any questions in the chat, so just
okay.
waiting for folks to, if they've got any questions, raise your hand or unmute yourself.
A quick question about the vegetation side. I noticed that the vegetation management cost was higher than undergrounding. Could you comment on that? Like, how is that? Like, how does that
Yeah,
work?
so that's that Berkeley lab, or not Berkeley, UC Berkeley working paper that looked at cost effectiveness, and their metric was that looking at what is the cost per avoided structure burned. And so the idea there is it's not looking at the overall cost, because per mile vegetation management is significantly less costly than undergrounding. Undergrounding is by far the most expensive solution on a per mile basis, but vegetation management, they found, is not cost effective when you look at least based on that metric of the avoided structures burned. Basically, you spend less money, but you don't get as much kind of bang for buck essentially out of that investment. And it is really costly over time, because you always have to go back every few years to do multiple cycles, and utilities will still continue to do vegetation management, but that particular enhanced vegetation management program that PG&E had has been found to be particularly not as cost effective relative to other solutions. And so they've talked about how they've changed their strategy to focus more on those fast trip settings and PSPS events that are targeted to the high risk areas and situations.
Thank you.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Hi, I have a quick question on your discussion about exposure data and asset vulnerabilities to natural hazards. I know you had a couple of slides where you went through some of the financial impacts to those physical, like those OT assets, when it comes to, let's say, like extreme temperatures and such like that. So I'm not sure if it's in there, but I just had a question on, if there's any like metrics or statistical weights for not only just OT assets, let's say there's like a blackout due to extreme weather, but also if there's any statistical weights for, let's say, drought for a period of time could degrade OT assets, and then there's financial repercussions for that, or is it mainly just like blackout data?
The utilities have access to a lot of data on the impact of different weather events, or prolonged heat, prolonged precipitation. Wind has a major factor on assets. And so the resilience plans in many cases do dive into a lot of detail in terms of exactly how they assessed that risk. But yeah, I don't have like one broad generalization to make about what are the major factors that drive asset failure. So yeah, I think the Bridging the Gap report that I mentioned should have some more detail there, but some of the utility resilience plans themselves, or their operational and strategic asset management practices will lay that out.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's all we have time for today. Thanks very much, Josh. Thanks to all of you who stayed till the end, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Marty?